The boy walked in like he owned the place. No knock, no hesitation. Just a small person in a red cap pushing open a door that no one in this house had dared push open in 4 months, crossing the room with the focused determination of someone who had identified a destination and intended to reach it, and stopping 2 feet from the wheelchair, like the wheelchair was the most ordinary thing he had ever seen. The man in the chair did not move. He had not moved for a long time, not in the way the boy was looking at him, openly, without flinching, without the particular management in the eyes that every adult who entered this room brought with them. The room was supposed to be impossible. The man in it was supposed to make it that way. 11 people had confirmed this in the last 4 months by leaving. The boy reached into his small fist and produced a cracker, held it out, not as a peace offering, not as strategy. The way a 2-year-old offered anything he valued, because he had it and the other person didn't, and the solution to that was self-evident. The man took the cracker, and then the boy, satisfied, put one hand on the armrest of the wheelchair, planted his small foot against the wheel, and climbed up. He settled into the man's lap like he had always intended this to be where he was, arranged himself, looked up at the face above him with the calm evaluation of a scientist confirming a hypothesis. "Chairman," he said. The most feared man in Seoul looked down at him. He said nothing. He did not move the boy. He did not call for anyone. He simply placed one hand, very slowly, on the small of the boy's back, so he wouldn't fall. From the doorway, a woman stood, watching. Her voice, when it came, was completely level. He got through the gate. The man looked up at her. Something in the room had already changed, something that could not be put back. If you are not subscribed yet, do it now, right now. Because what happens in this room and in this house, and between these people over the weeks that follow, is going to stay with you. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and do not go anywhere. No one touched him anymore. 4 months before Imani arrived, Kang Joon-ho had been standing in a parking structure on the 4th level when the first bullet hit. He remembered standing. He remembered the sound, not the shot itself, but which came as a crack so distant and flat he thought for one disoriented second that something had been dropped, but the sound of his own body hitting the concrete. He remembered that. The specific cold, the smell of oil and exhaust and something metallic that turned out to be blood. He remembered the face of his second-in-command, Park Seon-jae, appearing above him, and the way Seon-jae's expression told him everything he needed to know before the pain had even fully arrived. He didn't remember much after that for several days. What he woke to eventually was a hospital room and a doctor whose careful neutrality told him the rest. The bullet had not killed him. That was what the doctor kept saying, as though survival were the relevant metric. The bullet had not killed him. He had survived. What the bullet had done to his spine, the compression, the damage, the verdict delivered in the flat language of medicine, was a different sentence entirely. Partial. Incomplete. Those were the words they used, which meant he was not fully paralyzed, which meant sensation existed in diminishing, unreliable gradations below the injury, which meant that the question of what he would and wouldn't recover was a question no one could answer cleanly, and wouldn't be able to for months, possibly years, possibly ever. Joon-ho had lain in that hospital bed and listened to the doctor's careful language and felt, for the first time since he was 19 years old, genuinely afraid. Not of dying. He had walked toward death so many times in his life that it had stopped feeling like the enemy and started feeling like a known quantity, a familiar shape at the edge of every room. He was not afraid of it. He was afraid of this, of being carried out of a room instead of walking out, of the chair that appeared in his hospital room like an indictment, of the faces of his men when they came to see him, the careful deference, the deliberate absence of pity that was itself a form of pity, of the way every person who entered his space now moved around him differently, not around his power, around his damage. He had discharged himself from the hospital 11 days after the shooting, against every medical recommendation, and returned to the estate. And then, because the estate was his, and he was still, in every way that mattered, or the man who ran what ran in Seoul, he had closed the east wing around himself and made it entirely clear that its threshold was not to be crossed without permission. Permission, in practice, meant almost never. The first maid had lasted 6 days. The second had lasted 4. By the 6th, Mr. O had stopped providing any estimate of how long the current one might manage, because the estimates had become embarrassing. The 11th, a composed, experienced woman from the agency who had cared for difficult patients for 2 decades, had lasted 9 days, which was the record, and had left with the quiet precision of someone who had survived something and needed to put significant distance between herself and it before she could process what had happened. She had not, in her formal resignation, described any specific incident, or she had simply written, "I do not believe I am the right fit for this placement." Mr. O had read it at his desk, and then sat very still for a long time. He had called the agency the next morning and explained, with the particular calm of a man running out of options, that he needed someone different. He was not sure what different meant. He knew what it wasn't. He had 11 examples of what it wasn't. The agency had sent him Imani's file 2 days later. He had read it 3 times. She was 29. She had trained as a registered nurse in Atlanta before relocating to Seoul 3 years ago, following a partner who had then, in the reliable tradition of these things, left. She had a child. She had worked in 2 households before this one, both positive references, though one noted that she had, was when a household member had spoken to her in a way the reference described only as inappropriate, calmly and completely stopped speaking to that household member until a formal apology was issued. The reference did not sound disapproving. It sounded, if anything, slightly awed. Mr. O had called the agency back and said, "Send her." The room they gave Imani was on the 2nd floor of the residential wing, which was separated from the east wing by a long corridor and a set of double doors that were kept closed. It was larger than she'd expected, a proper bedroom with an adjoining sitting room, and beyond that, a smaller room that she immediately identified as where Theo would sleep. She stood in the doorway of the smaller room and looked at the child-sized bed that had been placed against the wall. Or someone had put a plush toy on it, a small bear, neatly positioned on the pillow. She had not expected the bear. She set Theo down. He crossed the room in his particular lurching walk and grabbed the bear, examined it with great seriousness, and then extended it toward her for review. "Bear," he said. "Bear," she agreed. He clutched it back to his chest with the gravity of someone taking custody of something important. She returned to her own room and sat on the edge of the bed and permitted herself, briefly, to calculate. The pay for this position was real, enough to clear the debt that had been accumulating since the partnership ended, and the shared expenses had become her expenses alone, enough to buy time. The agency had been clear. If she lasted 3 months, they would negotiate the rate upward. If she lasted 6, there were bonuses. Nobody had lasted 3 months yet. She opened the folder from the agency and read the medical summary one more time. Partial spinal cord injury, T6 level. Uses a manual wheelchair. Requires assistance with daily tasks as needed. The as needed had been underlined by someone at the agency, and she had a feeling the underlining was tactical, a hedge against the reality that he refused most assistance categorically, and the help he accepted was minimal and irregular, and extracted at significant personal cost to whoever was doing the extracting. She closed the folder. She had worked a trauma floor for 2 years. She had worked a home where the adult son had untreated personality disorder and had said things to her on a bad afternoon that she still kept filed away in a private place in her mind where she put things that had happened and could not be changed. She had worked for demanding people and difficult people and people who were suffering, and had decided, for complicated reasons, to make sure everyone around them suffered too. She was not naive about what she was walking into. What she was out of choices, and she had Theo to feed and a lease coming due on a city that had once felt like the beginning of something and had narrowed over the past year into a question of pure survival. So she would walk through those double doors, and she would do her job, and she would not flinch, and she would last the 3 months, and then the 6, because the alternative was going home to Atlanta with a toddler and a failure that she was not prepared to accept. She put the folder away. She went to check on Theo. He was already asleep, the bear tucked under his arm, the red cap still slightly crooked on his head, because she hadn't managed to take it off before he went down. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she went to bed. That night, after Theo was asleep, she lay in the unfamiliar dark of the room and listened to the estate. It had its own sound, different from the apartment she'd been renting in Mapo, different from the clinic she'd briefly worked at, different from any space she'd inhabited since coming to Seoul. Older, more composed. The walls didn't carry the particular thin vibration of a rented space that knows it's temporary. She thought about that, about what it meant to live inside a place that had decided it was permanent. She had been temporary so long, temporary in Atlanta before the move, temporary in the first apartment, temporary in the second, temporary in the gap between the partner leaving and the decisions that followed, that she had stopped noticing the quality of it, the lightness that was also a kind of rootlessness, the freedom that was also its exact opposite. She turned over. She looked at the ceiling. She was here for the money. She was here for Theo. She was here because options were a specific and finite resource, and she had run through most of hers. She knew all of that. She also knew, with the honesty she kept on the interior of herself where no one else went, that she was here because she had read the file on Kang Joon-ho 3 times and had felt, under the clinical language and the list of failed placements, something that was not fear, something more like recognition. She had spent 2 years in a trauma ward. She knew the shape of a person who was fighting, and it looked nothing like what the file described as difficult. She closed her eyes. She was going to last the 3 months, and after that, she was going to last the 6. She went to sleep. She met Kang Joon-ho the next morning. She had been told he would request her presence, and the request had come at 7 a.m. through Mr. O, which meant she'd had approximately 4 hours of sleep and a cup of coffee that she'd finished in the elevator, and was now regretting not making stronger. She'd dressed with care, not performing, just maintaining the version of herself that she took into professional spaces, the version that walked in straight and looked people in the eye and gave nothing away that she hadn't decided to give. She had been building this version since she was 23, and a supervisor had told her, in a phrase she had stored very precisely, that she would need to work twice as hard to be seen as half as competent. And she had decided in that supervisor's office that she was going to work 3 times as hard and be seen entirely on her own terms. The east wing doors were heavier than they looked. She pushed through them and walked down a corridor that was noticeably different from the rest of the estate. Not darker, exactly, but quieter. More compressed, like a space that had been pulling itself inward. The door at the end was open. She walked through it. The room was large, yet with floor-to-ceiling windows on one wall facing the estate's rear garden. Morning light came in flat and clean. A hospital bed had been installed against the far wall, adjusted to its full sitting height, though it wasn't occupied. Joon-ho was in the wheelchair by the window, and he was not looking at her. He was looking at the garden. She stood in the doorway and waited. He let her wait for a full minute. She knew what this was. She had seen this particular power move deployed by difficult patients and difficult employers alike. The wait was the test. How you responded to it told him everything he wanted to know. She stood. She did not shift her weight. She did not clear her throat. She looked at the side of his face and noted the line of his jaw, the way his hands rested on the wheelchair's arms. Not gripping, just resting, and with a stillness that was not relaxed. More like controlled. More like something very tightly managed. He was younger than she'd expected. 34, the file had said. He looked it, and he didn't. Simultaneously. The face was precisely that age, but everything in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his silence was older. Much older. He turned from the window and looked at her. You lasted longer than the others just standing there, he said. Most of them were already apologizing. I haven't done anything to apologize for yet. A pause, not a hostile one, just a space in which he seemed to be deciding what to do with her. Kang Joon-ho, he said. I know. Sit down. I'm fine standing. His eyes moved across her face with the specific focus of someone cataloguing information. She held the look without adjusting it. What the agency told you about the others, he said. They told me 11 people have left in 4 months. 12, the night staff from last week. 12 then. They also told you why. They told me you were difficult. She paused. Their word. What's your word? She considered him for a moment. The precision of the question, the slight edge beneath it, the test embedded inside a test. I don't have one yet, she said. I've known you for 4 minutes. The pause this time was longer. There's a schedule on the desk, he said. Morning assistance at 6:30 if I ring. Medications at 8. The room is cleaned when I'm not in it. You don't come in without asking. You don't rearrange anything. Why, you don't look at the files on the left side desk. Understood. You have a child. I do. He stays in your wing. He's 2 years old. I can't guarantee. He stays in your wing. No heat in it, just the flat, complete certainty of someone who was accustomed to having sentences finished by their weight alone. She looked at him. I'll do my best, she said. It was not the agreement he'd demanded. They both knew it. He seemed to file that away somewhere. That's all, he said, and turned back to the window. She walked back down the corridor, through the heavy doors, and stood in the main hall for a moment, with her hands at her sides. Her heart was going slightly faster than she'd have liked. Not fear. Something else, or the specific tension of someone who has just entered a room where the air pressure is different and whose body has correctly noted the change. She went to get Theo ready for the day. The first 2 weeks passed in a rhythm. She learned the estate, the kitchen, run by a man named Chef Bay, who communicated primarily through the temperature and composition of the food he sent to the East Wing. Warmer food, she noticed, seemed to correlate with lighter days. She learned the garden, which Theo immediately decided was his personal territory, and which the groundskeeper, a quiet older man named Mr. Shin, seemed to accept with the equanimity of someone who had watched many children discover the garden and had decided long ago that this was fine. She and Mr. Shin developed their own working relationship in those first weeks, he with his limited English and she with her limited Korean, and both of them with the shared vocabulary of gestures and garden knowledge that crossed both gaps. He showed her the names of things in Korean, and she told him the names in English, and Theo learned both simultaneously, the way children learned languages, without effort, without hierarchy, as though all words for things were equally valid and equally available, which she had come to believe was actually the most accurate way to understand language. She learned Mr. O, who was precise and formal, and whose formality, she gradually came to understand, was a form of protectiveness, of the household, of its routines, or of whatever equilibrium had been established in the gap between the man Joon-ho had been and the man he was now. Mr. O had been with the family for 9 years. He had watched the shooting's aftermath reshape the estate, like weather reshapes a landscape, slowly, completely, in ways that were permanent. She learned Joon-ho at a distance, which was the only proximity he permitted. She left his medications outside the East Wing door at 8. The tray came back out at 9, empty. She cleaned the room on Tuesday and Friday mornings while he was in the garden. He went to the garden alone, navigating the adapted path that had been installed after the shooting, and she had learned to time her cleaning to his absence and to be finished before he returned. Because on the one morning she'd misjudged and still been in the room when he came back, the quality of the silence between them had been so compressed and so clearly communicating something that she had finished quickly and left without speaking. He did not ring for morning assistance. She gathered, from Mr. O's carefully neutral mentions of it, that he hadn't rung for it once since the injury, that the tasks it was designed to cover were performed by Joon-ho alone. However long they took, however difficult, in a private war he was fighting entirely by himself. She did not offer. On the 14th day, she was in the kitchen at 6 in the morning when she heard a sound from the corridor that led toward the East Wing. She recognized it, the specific rhythm of a wheelchair on marble, or the small catch at the tile join near the kitchen door that she'd noticed before because she'd seen Joon-ho's jaw set slightly every time he crossed it. She did not turn around. She poured her coffee. She moved the kettle. She was aware, with the whole back of her body, that he had stopped somewhere behind her. The silence lasted about 15 seconds. "There's a catch in the tile," she said, still facing the counter. "Near the door. Mr. O has been notified. They're fixing it Thursday." Nothing. She turned around. He was in the kitchen doorway, and the expression on his face was not one she'd seen before. Not the controlled blankness he kept deployed like armor, and not the specific volcanic anger that Mr. O had warned her appeared without signal and disappeared just as fast. It was something else, a startled quality, like someone who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found it rearranged. "The coffee is the blend you had on file," she said. "I can make you a cup." I'm making myself one anyway." She held up the pot. "It would take 4 seconds." He looked at the pot. He looked at her. "Fine," he said. She poured 2 cups. She put his on the kitchen island, which was at the right height for him to reach, and stepped back to give him room, and drank her own coffee with her back half-turned, so he wasn't performing anything for her attention. She heard the chair move. She heard him pick up the cup. They drank their coffee in the same room without speaking, and when he left without saying anything, and she turned around to find his cup washed and placed upside down in the drying rack. She stared at it for a moment. Then she finished her coffee and went to get Theo. It was Theo's third week on the estate. Imani had established, with considerable effort, a system for the hours when she needed to clean or manage tasks in parts of the estate that weren't the play corner she'd set up in their sitting room. The system involved a series of locks, a baby monitor that she'd tested until she was confident in its range, and a thorough Theo-proofing of every accessible area. She had also had a conversation with every member of staff about what Theo was and was not permitted to access, which had been received with varying degrees of amusement and complete cooperation. She had not accounted for the nature of the specific kind of focused, determined ingenuity that manifests in a 2-year-old who decides he wants something. She was in the laundry room with the door propped. She could hear the monitor. She could hear Theo in their sitting room, narrating something to the bear in the running commentary that seemed to be his natural state, a continuous stream of observation and opinion that she sometimes thought was probably the most honest account of how anyone actually experienced the world. She heard him say, "Lion." She went back to folding. She heard him say, with greater conviction, "Lion." She looked up. The monitor was quiet. No alarm, no distress. She returned to the sheet she was folding. 30 seconds later, she became aware that the narrative from the monitor had stopped. She was out of the laundry room before she'd consciously decided to move. Down the corridor, into the sitting room. The baby gate, which she had attached and tested and attached again, was open. Not broken. Open. Theo had figured out the mechanism. She stood at the gate for one suspended second, and then she was moving. She checked the hall. She checked the staircase. She checked the garden door. Closed. She turned and looked at the corridor that led toward the kitchen, toward the estate's central rooms, toward the east wing, and at the far end of it, just visible as he rounded the corner, was a small person in a red cap carrying a cracker and a bear with the purposeful gait of someone who had a destination in mind. "Theo." She kept her voice low, neutral, the voice that meant, "Come here right now," in a tone that did not alarm him into running. He did not hear her, or he chose not to, and he rounded the corner and was gone. She crossed the corridor in 11 steps and turned the corner. The east wing doors were open. Not fully. One was ajar, the gap just wide enough for a toddler and a bear. She pushed through it. She walked fast and quiet down the corridor, heart in her throat, calculating the math of how much trouble she was in, and finding it very, very large. Joon-ho had been clear. She had promised to try. The doors were open, and Theo was somewhere beyond them. She reached the end of the corridor and pushed the door open. Theo was in the room. He was standing approximately 2 feet from Kang Joon-ho's wheelchair, looking up at Joon-ho with the evaluating expression he reserved for things he hadn't encountered before. He had the cracker in one hand. The bear was under his arm. Joon-ho had gone completely still. Not the controlled stillness she'd seen before, the deliberate management of himself in space. This was a different kind of stillness, a person who had been caught without their armor and had not yet found it again. Theo extended the cracker. "Cracker," he said, with the polite certainty of someone making an introduction. Nobody moved. Imani was in the doorway, and she was calculating, voice or silence, enter or hold, how to extract her son without triggering the volcanic anger she'd been warned about, how to manage this. And then she watched Kang Joon-ho, the man Seoul feared, the man who had sent 12 caregivers away in 4 months, look down at the cracker being offered to him by a 2-year-old who had no idea who he was. Joon-ho took the cracker. It was the smallest possible motion. He reached down, 2 fingers, and took the cracker from Theo's hand. Theo beamed. He then, with no apparent hesitation, and the absolute confidence of someone who has assessed a situation and found it acceptable, walked to the side of the wheelchair, put his hand on the armrest, and began the determined process of attempting to climb into Joon-ho's lap. Imani took 1 step forward. Joon-ho looked up at her. Not angry. Something much stranger than angry. Theo completed the climb. He settled into Joon-ho's lap like he had always intended this to be where he was, arranged the bear, and looked up at Joon-ho's face with the same evaluating interest he'd been applying to the stone lions 3 weeks ago. "Chairman," Theo announced. Joon-ho looked down at him. The entire room was holding its breath. Then, very slowly, with the precision of someone who hadn't done this in a very long time and wasn't sure of the mechanism, Joon-ho put 1 hand on the small of Theo's back so he wouldn't fall. Imani stood in the doorway and did not move. Theo ate his cracker. He pointed at the window. He said something about the garden that was more syllables than words. He shared the latter half of the cracker without being asked, pressing it against Joon-ho's closed fist. And when Joon-ho opened his hand and accepted it, Theo nodded with great satisfaction, as though this confirmed something he had already known. After what might have been 5 minutes, or might have been 15, Joon-ho looked up at Imani again. She crossed the room. She lifted Theo, who made a brief protest, and then subsided, and she looked at Joon-ho across the distance of 3 feet and said, "I'm sorry. The gate," and stopped because what she was seeing on his face was not what she'd expected, and she needed to account for it. "The tile fix is scheduled for Thursday," he said. It was not a response to what she'd said. It was a response to something else. She wasn't sure what yet. "Yes," she said. "Keep the gate mechanism higher," he said. "He's smart." She looked at him. "He is," she said. She looked at Joon-ho 1 more time before she turned. She could not name what was in his face with any single word she had. It was too many things, simultaneously. The controlled man, and the man behind the control, and something even further behind that. Something that looked young in the way grief makes people young. The way loss finds the part of a person that was there before, everything they built on top of it. Oh, she had a word for it now. She had been in that room for 4 minutes, and the word had come to her with the quiet certainty of clinical observation, and she was going to put it away and not take it out again until she was sure she had earned the right to hold it. She carried Theo out of the east wing and back down the corridor, and she did not look back, and she held Theo a little tighter than usual until they were in their wing and the door was closed behind them. She put him down. He held up the bear. "Chairman," he said, with pleased certainty. "Yes," she said. "Chairman." She sat down on the floor next to him and let her heart rate return to normal and thought about the expression on Kang Joon-ho's face when he had looked down at her son. She had seen a lot of faces on a lot of difficult days. She had spent 2 years in trauma care, watching people who had been reduced by injury, by fear, by the specific violence of realizing the body's limits, stripped of everything they'd built and left with only what they actually were. She knew that look. She had not expected to see it here. She filed it away and said nothing about it to anyone. The tile was fixed on Thursday. Imani was there when the maintenance team came, and she watched Joon-ho wheel across the corrected join without comment, and she did not acknowledge it, and neither did he, and they both knew it had been done. This was how things changed in the East Wing. Not announced. Not acknowledged. Just done. And the doing noted by both of them in the silence between. She started leaving the coffee set up in the kitchen at 5:50. He started appearing in the kitchen at 6. They did not discuss this. They drank coffee and usually said very little, and what was said was practical. The schedule, the weather, once a brief exchange about the garden, because she'd asked Mr. Shin to plant something near the adapted path that would come up in spring, and she'd mentioned it in case it changed his route. He had asked what she was planting. She'd said lavender. He hadn't responded. The following Tuesday, she arrived in the garden to find that Mr. Shin had already expanded the planting area and marked the borders, and the lavender had been ordered from 3 different nurseries. She told Theo about it at bedtime. "The garden is getting more flowers," she said. "Flowers," Theo said. "Lavender. It smells nice." "Chairman's garden?" She looked at him. "But he lives here," she said. "So yes." "Chairman's flowers," Theo said, with the satisfied finality of someone who has understood the arrangement. Theo's visits to the East Wing were not repeated in the accidental way they'd begun. But Joon-ho, one morning in the 3rd week of November, appeared at the kitchen at his usual time and said, without preamble, "Where is he?" She looked up. "Theo, still sleeping." "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe." Joon-ho said nothing. He drank his coffee. At 18 minutes, Theo appeared at the kitchen doorway in pajamas with the bear, assessed the room, and made directly for Joon-ho with the certainty of someone going to a known quantity. "Chairman," he said. "Theo," Joon-ho said. Just that. The visits became a quiet fixture of the morning. And Theo would bring something to show him, a stone from the garden, a drawing he'd made, the bear with a new item tied around its neck that Imani recognized as having come from somewhere in the estate and could never quite trace to its source. Joon-ho received these objects with the gravity they deserved. He began keeping them on the left corner of his desk, the corner furthest from the files she wasn't allowed to look at, the corner where the light was best. She noticed. She didn't comment. She watched, though. She couldn't help watching, because what happened between Joon-ho and Theo in those morning visits was not something she'd seen before in any form. It was not performance. It was not tolerance. It was the specific thing that happened when a person who had been defending themselves against all incoming contact encountered something so small and so certain and so absolutely uninterested in the defense that the defense became irrelevant. Theo did not care that Joon-ho was dangerous. He could not process that category. He processed, instead, "This person stays still and looks at me and answers my questions. This person accepts my crackers and my stones and my bear for inspection. This person's lap is comfortable and his hand is steady, and he says my name the way people say a name when they mean it." In Theo's assessment, this added up to known quantity, safe harbor, chairman. She thought sometimes about the impossibility of it, the specific statistical improbability of the gate being open, and Theo finding his way through it, and the door at the end of the corridor being the door at the end of the corridor. She thought about all the variables that could have been different and hadn't been, and she thought that this was either the universe demonstrating its indifference or the universe demonstrating something else entirely, and she had learned enough in 30 years to know those two options were not always as different as they appeared. She also noticed other things. The way his men moved around him had not changed. The deference, the careful management of the space between themselves and the wheelchair. But she began to notice the content of the conversations that came through the East Wing doors, the measured voices of Seon-jae and the others, the way the business of whatever Joon-ho ran was conducted with the same precision as before, maybe sharper, the injury having compressed his focus the way compression sometimes does to things that are already hard. He was not less. That was what she was beginning to understand. He was the same thing he had always been, contained in a different architecture. The empire was still his, the power was still his. The fear his name generated in the voices of people who called the estate and didn't know she could hear was still entirely intact. What had changed was something interior. Some machinery of himself that the shooting had altered. She had seen this before, in other forms. The medical term was adjustment disorder, though she'd always thought that was too clean a phrase for something that was really about the specific grief of losing a version of yourself that you'd relied on and having to figure out what was left. She knew what was left in him. She could see it in the way he handled Theo, careful, steady, one hand always placed to prevent a fall. She could see it in the lavender. She could see it in the washed coffee cup in the drying rack every morning. What she was not going to do was say any of this aloud. December arrived and brought with it a cold that settled into the estate like a presence of its own. In the floor tiles, in the drafts at the east wing windows, in Theo's insistence on investigating the garden every morning, regardless of temperature, which was a battle she was losing, or she had taken to bundling him in layers and letting him have his 15 minutes with the frost, while she monitored from the doorway with her hands wrapped around a cup. She was doing this on a Wednesday morning, watching Theo crouch over a patch of frozen ground with the focused attention of someone conducting a scientific inquiry, when she became aware that Joon-ho had come to stand, to position himself, at the window that faced the garden. He did not know she could see his reflection in the glass of the door. She watched him watch Theo, and the expression on his face was one she recognized from the first morning in the East Wing, that undefended quality, that briefness of being completely human. He watched the boy with something that had no tactical purpose in it, no management, no armor. Just watching, just feeling whatever it was that Theo, with his red cap and his bear and his absolute disregard for the concept of intimidation, had managed to locate in Joon-ho that everyone else had failed to reach. She looked away before he could see her looking. She called Theo in. She bundled him inside. She did not mention the window. That evening, a heavier blanket appeared in their room, one of the good ones from the cedar chest in the third bedroom. It had been placed on the foot of Theo's bed, folded precisely, without comment or explanation. She stood in Theo's doorway and looked at it for a long time. It was Park Seon-jae who told her. She hadn't asked. She didn't ask questions about the business of the East Wing. That had been her rule from the beginning, and the boundary she kept firmly because it was the boundary that made everything else possible. She was here to do her job. What happened beyond the double doors was not her business. But Seon-jae had a habit of arriving early for meetings and sitting in the kitchen, and she was in the kitchen on a Thursday morning in mid-December when he came in and sat down and said, "You're still here." "December 15th, she said. "I'm still here." The others lasted less than a month. He poured himself coffee without asking, which she'd come to understand was standard for him. "You're at 2 months?" "Almost." "He's different." Seon-jae said this the way someone says a fact they've been observing for long enough that they've decided it's real. "With you here? Different." She looked at him. "Different how?" "Less." He stopped, considered. Less like he's waiting for something to stop. She understood what that meant. She had her own clinical language for it, but his was more accurate for what she'd been seeing. "He's adjusting," she said. "He's been shot before." Seon-jae said it without drama. 3 years ago, the shoulder. He was back in a week. This is different because... He stopped again. "Because he can't recover back to what he was," she said. He has to recover to something new, and he doesn't know what new looks like. Seonjae looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Your son," he said. "He's a good kid. He is. The boss." He paused. "He doesn't let things near him. People, I mean. He's been that way since—" He gestured, an ellipsis for something too large to complete. "Since before the shooting. And since the thing before the shooting." She waited. "His daughter died," Seonjae said. 4 years ago. She was 3. There was a fever. It came fast, and it was—" He stopped. "She was 3. And after that, he made himself into something that couldn't be reached. Because it worked. Because if nothing can reach you, nothing can—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She sat very still and let the information rearrange her. Not her opinion of him. He was still who he was. Still the man who ran what he ran. Still the complicated and difficult truth of this house. But the architecture of him reorganized in her mind into something that made a different kind of sense. The controlled stillness that she'd identified as deliberately intimidating was also grief. The volcanic anger that Mr. O had warned her about was also grief. The total refusal to let anyone close enough to help was also, and she recognized this because she had sat with enough people who were doing it. Protection. The most desperate and least effective kind. The kind that said, "If I can keep everything at a distance, then nothing else can reach the place inside me that has already been broken, beyond what I thought I could survive." She had seen this in the ward. She had seen it in other forms in other people. She had never expected to see it here, in this house, in this particular configuration. She thought about Theo climbing into that lap without asking permission. She thought about a cracker extended to a man who had not allowed anything near him in 4 years. "I'm not going to tell him you told me," she said. "I know. And it doesn't change what I'm here to do. I know that too." He finished his coffee and stood up. "I'm telling you because you should understand what you're dealing with. Not to give you leverage, just to—" He paused at the door. "He's a difficult man. He earned most of the difficult. But the part that can't let anything in, that part isn't who he is. It's what happened to him." He left. She sat in the kitchen with her coffee going cold and looked at nothing for a long time. She thought about how grief worked on a person. Not abstractly, but in the specific physical language of it. The way it found the load-bearing walls and settled there. The way a person stopped running toward things and started running the perimeter of what was left, keeping watch so nothing else could be taken. She understood. She also understood, more fully now, what it meant that her 2-year-old son had walked through that perimeter without noticing it was there. She did not look at him differently after that. She was careful about that. She had spent enough time around people who had suffered to know that the knowledge of someone's wound was not a key. It was an obligation. The obligation to not use it, and not reference it, and not let it make you clumsy around them. She kept the schedule. She left the medications. She made the coffee. She bundled Theo and watched the garden and did not say anything about the things she noticed. But she was beginning to notice more. The way he read. Everything. Constantly. 4 or 5 books stacked on the right side of the desk with bookmarks at different depths. The way he listened to music in the evenings, or something classical that she could hear faintly through the east wing doors, which she'd memorized enough of now to have looked it up. Suk, mostly. Check, meditative. Not the music of a man performing taste, but of a man who found something in it that was his. The way he spoke to Theo. Not simplified, Not the particular register adults used with children, that was really the register of someone performing their own gentleness. He spoke to Theo the way she suspected he'd spoken to a 3-year-old girl who wasn't here anymore. Direct, honest, interested in what Theo was saying. She kept all of this internal. She folded it and put it in the part of herself that was still the person who had trained in a trauma ward and knew the difference between observation and attachment. She was very aware that the line between them was getting harder to find. Christmas came quietly to the estate. She had not expected anything. This was a place of business more than a home, and she hadn't asked about traditions, and she was an outsider here in every sense that compounded. An outsider by nationality, by language, by the particular layered visibility of being who she was in a space that had not been built with her in mind. She had developed her peace with this over 3 years in Seoul. Not resignation, but a kind of determined clarity. She was here. She was capable. She took up the space she occupied without apology, and in return, she did not ask the space to be more comfortable for her than it was. She was, she knew, a specific kind of lonely. The loneliness of competence in a foreign room. The loneliness of being excellent at something in a place that would always, no matter how excellent she was, assign her competence to a category before assigning it to her name. She had been sitting with this loneliness since the move. It was familiar. It was not the same as suffering. But on Christmas Eve, in the sitting room of an estate in Seoul, with a wine glass and the memory of her mother's kitchen, it had a particular weight. On Christmas Eve, she put Theo to bed early and sat in the sitting room with a glass of wine she'd bought herself, and the specific loneliness of the holidays that had followed her from Atlanta to Seoul, and had made itself at home in every new space she occupied. She thought about her mother in Atlanta, who would be watching television right now, who had asked her to come home, and to whom she had said not yet. She thought about the version of Seoul she'd arrived in 3 years ago, full of a beginning she'd believed in, and the version she was sitting in now. She didn't regret it. That was the thing she kept checking for, and consistently not finding. She had Theo, and she had her competence, and she had this job, which was hard and strange, and was making her feel things she was carefully not naming. She was not in a position to regret anything. A knock at the sitting room door. She looked up. The door was already slightly open. She'd left it open so she could hear Theo. Mr. O was in the doorway, holding something. "From the East Wing," he said. "I was asked to deliver it." He handed her a package, small, wrapped in plain paper, a card attached. She took it, and Mr. O left with the discretion of someone who has been managing other people's business for long enough to know when not to be present. She opened the card. It said, "For you, not for the job. KJH. She sat for a moment. Then she opened the package. It was a medical textbook, a current edition, dense and technical, the specific one she'd been eyeing in a bookshop near the estate, and hadn't bought because the price point was more than she could justify. She had no memory of mentioning it to anyone. She could not trace how he would have known. She held it in her lap for a long time. She thought about the bookshop, which she had mentioned to no one. She thought about the walk she'd taken alone on a Saturday afternoon in November, which was also the day she'd stood in front of the textbook for 5 minutes and then walked away because she could not justify it. She thought about the fact that the estate was large and the grounds were covered by security, and someone had been watching her walk across the estate and down the block to the bookshop, not as surveillance, but as attention. The particular kind of attention that notices what a person wants and files it without comment. She had not realized anyone was paying that kind of attention to her. She sat with that. Then she got up, went to the sitting room desk, and wrote a card in her best handwriting. She didn't spend long on it. She wrote what was true, simply, the way she tried to do everything. She wrote, "Thank you. Not for the book, for the attention it took to know." She handed it to Mr. Oh, in the morning. She didn't know if he read it before Christmas or after. She didn't ask. All she knew was that on the 27th of December, when she came to the kitchen at 5:50, there were 2 cups already set out. He had made the coffee. January came in cold and exact, and with it a change she hadn't anticipated. A man arrived on the 5th. She was in the garden with Theo when the car came up the drive, and she would not have thought anything of it. Cars came to the estate regularly. This was a business as much as a home, except that she heard, from the open kitchen window, the quality of Mr. O's voice change when he greeted whoever had arrived. A different register, formal in a way that was not his usual formality. Careful. She did not go inside immediately. But she shortened the garden visit and had Theo inside within 10 minutes, and she was in the hallway near the kitchen when she heard the voice coming from the direction of the east wing. Not Seon-jae, not any of the men she'd become familiar with. Someone new, and the particular quality of how his voice filled the corridor, expansive, assured, with the specific confidence of someone who did not expect to adjust himself for the spaces he entered, told her something without giving her any details. She found out the details from Mr. O that afternoon. Kang Byung-soo, Joon-ho's uncle, and, in the month since the shooting, the man who had been, as Mr. O put it, with the careful language of someone describing something they didn't approve of, stepping into certain responsibilities. "How certain?" she asked. Mr. O looked at her, or the kind that require stepping back out when the chair is no longer vacant. She understood. She also understood now the compressed quality of the estate's atmosphere when Byung-soo was in the building. The way the staff moved differently. The way Seon-jae's jaw was set at dinner. The way the men who worked in the East Wing became more precise, less relaxed, performing their competence at a higher register than usual, because someone in the building was watching for gaps. She had been around power her entire life, not this kind of power, but power, and she had learned before she had language for it that the most dangerous version was not the loudest. The loudest version announced itself. The dangerous version watched. It calculated. It waited with the patience of something that believed time was working in its favor. Now Byung-soo watched. She felt it in the hallway conversation, in the way he'd looked at her not with disrespect, but with assessment, the same way she'd been looked at by people who were trying to figure out whether she was a liability or an asset, and had not yet decided. She was neither, she thought. She was Imani. She was here to do her job. And whatever calculation Byung-soo was running on the estate and its people, she was going to be a variable he hadn't accounted for, not because she was looking for conflict, but because she intended to be exactly herself in every room she entered, which tended to confuse people who expected something more manageable. She kept her schedule. She left the medications. She made the coffee. On the morning of the 6th, Joon-ho did not come to the kitchen. On the 7th, he didn't come either. She made 2 cups anyway. She left his on the counter and drank hers and went about her morning. When she came back, 2 hours later, his cup was gone. She didn't know if he'd taken it or if it had been cleared away. On the 8th morning, he was there when she arrived. He looked, she thought, tired. Not physically. He had the same precise control of himself in space, the same still quality. But something behind his eyes was doing more work than usual. She poured the coffee. She put his cup in the usual place. "Byung-soo's here," he said. She could have said, "I know." She said, "Is that difficult?" The pause. "It's complicated." Complicated how? He looked at her. She had learned to hold his gaze without adjustment, not challenging, just present. He'd stopped testing it after the first week. Or he runs things while He stopped, the particular stop of someone who was choosing a word and not finding any of the available ones adequate. "While I'm here." "And now he's checking on his investment," she said. Joon-ho looked at her. "That's one way to put it. Is it wrong?" "No." Flat. "It's exactly right." She drank her coffee. "You're still in the chair." "Yes." "And the business is still running." "Yes." "So his investment is still there." She put her cup down. "That seems like information he already has." Joon-ho was quiet. "The question," she said, "is what he's planning to do with it." She left him with that and went to get Theo ready. Byung-soo stayed 4 days. She encountered him directly on the 3rd day in the corridor near the kitchen. He was a big man, taller than Joon-ho, broader, but with the well-dressed solidity of someone who had built themselves into a shape they were satisfied with. He looked at her with the specific quality of assessment that she recognized and had her own way of handling. "The maid," he said. "The maid," she agreed. "I've been wondering about you." He said it pleasantly. "The one who's lasted." "Yes." "What's your secret?" She looked at him. "I do my job." He smiled. It did not reach anything. Just that simple. Most things are. He looked at her for a long moment. At her, not at the professional shell of her, really looked, in a way that was not threatening, and was not polite, and was something in between that she had a great deal of experience identifying. "He speaks of you," Byung-soo said. "Or rather, he doesn't avoid speaking of you. With him, but it's the same thing." She said nothing. "You have a child?" "I do." "And you bring the child here?" He said it neutrally. Neutrally enough that she heard the edge inside it. "The agency confirmed the terms," she said. "Mr. Kang Joon-ho confirmed the terms." "Of course." He smiled again. "I'm simply noting the arrangement." He walked away. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter with both hands flat on the tile and breathed slowly and steadily for about 30 seconds. Then she went to find Theo. Byung-soo left on the afternoon of the 4th day. The estate exhaled. She could feel it, in Chef Bay's kitchen, where the temperature of the food returned to something more generous, and in the groundskeeper's work outside, which became less invisible, and in the quality of Seon-jae's voice when he came for his Thursday meeting, which had something easier in it. She was in the laundry room when she heard Joon-ho's voice in the corridor, not talking to anyone present. She could hear he was on a call, and the voice was the one she'd learned to recognize as the business voice, the one that had no temperature. She was not trying to listen. But she heard, "Not yet. Give it another month." And, "It isn't a question of physical." A pause. "My ability to manage this organization has not been affected." And then, quieter, which meant he'd heard something in the silence on the other end. "I know what he thinks. I know what he's planning." A pause. "Let him plan." She finished the laundry and carried it down the corridor and did not mention any of it to anyone. She was up at 2 in the morning with a thermometer and a cold cloth and the particular focused calm she'd developed in the pediatric ward rotation, working the clinical protocol and holding the panic in a separate part of herself that she would access later, when he was better. She'd sat on the floor of his room with her back against the wall and watched his chest rise and fall and done the math on the fever every 20 minutes, the way they'd trained her. not letting herself think in any direction except the clinical one, because the clinical one was the useful one. The other directions, the ones that involved being alone in a foreign country in the middle of the night with a sick child, she sealed off completely. She was practiced at sealing things off. It was one of the most useful skills she had, and also, she acknowledged in the sealed part of herself, one of the most expensive. It worked. It cost. By 4:30 the fever had broken its back. By 6 he was warm but moving, asking for crackers with the persistent appetite of a child who had already processed the interruption and returned to his primary concerns. She was profoundly, physically grateful. She was also the specific kind of exhausted that lived past, tired into something that felt structural, like the scaffolding had been removed, and what was left was still standing, but aware of the effort required to stay that way. She went to the kitchen. She moved with the wooden efficiency of someone operating on system rather than energy. She did not hear him come in until he spoke. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Theo had a fever. He's fine." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sit down." She looked at him. I'll make the coffee." He was already at the counter. "Sit down." She sat down at the kitchen island. She watched him make the coffee. He knew the routine. He'd watched her do it for 2 months. And she felt, with the particular vulnerability of someone who was overtired and had spent the night afraid, a sudden and inconvenient pressure behind her eyes. She held it. Clinical reflex. He put the cup in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. "Thank you." "He's fine," Joon-ho said, not asking, confirming. "He's fine. Children run fevers." Something in how he said it, not clinical, not reassuring in the performed way. Something that knew this from inside. "Yes," she said carefully. He sat across from her with his own cup, and they were quiet for a long time. And the morning came into the kitchen grey and cold, and she drank the coffee he'd made, and let the pressure behind her eyes subside, and neither of them said anything about what was happening. Because what was happening was that she was letting herself be cared for, briefly, by the man she was employed to care for, and both of them were choosing not to name it. When she got up to check on Theo, she turned at the kitchen door and said, "He's going to want to see you this morning, when he wakes up." Joon-ho looked at her over his cup. "Tell him I'll be in the garden at 9, he said. She went to check on her son. February brought the first real snow of the season. Seoul went white overnight, and Theo, who had never in his 2 years seen snow, stood at the sitting-room window the next morning in a kind of silent astonishment that Imani recognized as the highest form of reverence he was capable of expressing. He stood there for a full 2 minutes without saying anything, which was unusual. He pressed his hand flat against the glass and looked at his own handprint in the condensation, and then looked back at the white world outside. Then he turned to her with an expression she would keep for the rest of her life. Pure wonder, distilled to its most essential form, the face of someone for whom the world has just demonstrated that it is larger and stranger and more generous than they had understood. "What is it?" he asked. "Snow," she said. He turned back to the window. "Snow," he said, testing it, satisfying himself with it, and filing it in the correct internal category alongside stones and beetles and the stone lions and the chairman and all the other discoveries that made up his ongoing investigation of the world. She let him look. She made coffee. She thought about the month she'd been given by the agency. 3 months she'd hit them, and about the bonus and about the conversation she needed to have with herself about what she was doing here and how much of it was still about the money. She was not unaware of the problem. The problem was that she had spent 2 months telling herself she was here because of the financial reality, the rent, the choices she didn't have, the options that had run out. All of that was still true. The money was still necessary. The lease was still real. But the money was no longer all of it. And she knew it, and the knowing was sitting in her chest like a stone she was carrying around and not yet prepared to put down. She had catalogued it clinically at first. The observation that Kang Joon-ho was more complex than his reputation. The observation that the man behind the armor was more functional than the armor suggested. The observation that the way he handled Theo was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him, and that the unguarded thing was good, real, something she found herself thinking about at inconvenient times. She had a clinical category for what she was feeling. She knew its name. She also knew that the clinical category did not begin to cover the specific weight of it, the way her day organized itself differently since January, with him at the center of a gravity she was pretending not to orbit. She was a black woman in Seoul, working in a house that belonged to a man who ran a criminal empire, who was Korean and powerful and injured and grieving something he'd never named in front of her, whose world had no architecture for her except the one she'd built herself by showing up every morning and refusing to flinch. This was the most dangerous thing she had ever considered. She was considering it anyway. She almost left in February. She had not expected this to happen. The almost leaving was not about Joon-ho. It was about Byung-soo, who had been in contact with the agency. She found out through Mr. O, who told her with the careful face he used when delivering information he disapproved of. The agency had received an inquiry about modifying the terms of her placement. The inquiry was not from the estate. It was from Byung-soo. The modification proposed was the removal of the child from the residence. She sat in her room that evening and looked at the wall. This was the part she had not let herself think about directly, because thinking about it directly made it real in a way that required a response, and she had not been ready for the response. Now she was sitting with it fully, the fluorescent weight of it. She had Theo in the next room, and she had this job, which was the thing standing between her and a set of choices she could not afford to revisit, and someone had reached outside this house and tried to take part of it away from her. She had been aware, intellectually, that Byung-soo was a variable. She had understood from Seon-jae's careful mentions that the uncle was a complication, a pending problem, or a person who had grown comfortable in the space that Joon-ho's injury had opened, and who would not give that space back without effort. She had known all of this in the abstract way. She knew many things about this house. The way she'd learned to hold information about the East Wing at a clinical distance. She had not expected it to come for Theo. She sat there for a long time and felt, one by one, the options available to her. She could comply with the modification. She could not comply and leave. She could wait and see if the estate pushed back. She stopped. She thought about Joon-ho saying, "He doesn't speak for this house." She hadn't heard it yet. She hadn't knocked on the East Wing door. She was sitting in her room, calculating her options based on a scenario that had not yet played out, because she was afraid to find out that the man she had been watching all these months would not, in the end, choose what she thought he might choose. That was the real fear. Not the money. Not the lease. The fear that she had been reading him wrong, that the warmth she'd seen accumulating, the 3 cups, the lavender, the careful hand on Theo's back, had not been what she thought, and that when it cost something, the cost would be paid by her. She had been afraid of being wrong about people before. She had been wrong before in ways that had mattered. She had followed someone across the world, and he had not been who she thought, and she had been left in a foreign city with a baby and a lease and the particular kind of alone that felt different in another language. She knew what it felt like to be wrong, while she sat with the fear of it. She let it be real. And then she got up, because she had also learned, from the ward, from the people she'd cared for, from the specific education of having survived, that the only way through the fear of being wrong was to find out. That sitting with the fear was not the same as being protected from the outcome. That she had come to this estate because she refused to let her choices run out, and sitting in this room was doing exactly that. She got up. She went to the east wing. She knocked on the door. And what she found on the other side was not someone who was calculating what her departure would cost. It was someone who was already certain of what it would not be. She never knocked on the east wing door. There was a silence, and then Joon-ho's voice. Yes. She opened the door. He was at the desk, and when he saw her face, he set down what he was reading. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. Byung-soo contacted the agency. He wants Theo removed from the placement terms. Joon-ho was very still. "I need to know," she said, "if that reflects your position." Silence. "Because if it does," she said, and her voice was steady, because she had decided she would be steady for this, even if it cost her everything, then I need to have a conversation with the agency and start looking at other options, and I appreciate that this is difficult timing, and I am genuinely. She stopped, reset. I am doing this job well, I know that, and Theo is not a disruption, and I know you know that too. But if this is coming from inside the estate, it's not, Joon-ho said. She looked at him. "No, he doesn't speak for this house." His voice was flat, the business voice, the one with no temperature. "He hasn't spoken for this house since I'm sitting in it. The terms don't change." She held the look for a moment longer, because she needed to be sure. "I'll contact the agency in the morning," she said. "Tell them the terms were confirmed by me directly. If they need it in writing, Seon-jae will handle it." She nodded. She turned to go. "Imani." She turned back. He was looking at her with that expression again. The undefended one. The one she'd first seen the morning she'd mentioned the tile. Something that was not entirely managed. "He's not taking anything from this house," Joon-ho said. "That's a decision I made. Not about the child. About..." He stopped. About everything. She understood what he meant. She understood more of what he meant than she was prepared to let herself know right now. "Good night," she said. "Good night." She walked back to her wing with her heart loud in her chest, and her hands very steady, and her mind doing the work of knowing something she was going to need a little more time before she could put down. She called the agency in the morning. Seon-jae sent the paperwork before noon. The modification request was formally declined, with the estate's authorization attached. Byung-soo was not at the estate that day. She didn't know where he was. She didn't ask. She made coffee for two and went about her day. March arrived, and with it, something that changed the temperature of the estate entirely. She had been aware, in the peripheral way she kept awareness of the business that moved through the East Wing, that something was being planned. Not the regular rhythm of organizational management, something with a different frequency to it. The meetings ran longer. Seon-jae's composure had an extra layer to it, the compressed calm of someone carrying operational weight. The men who came and went through the estate moved with more purpose. She did not ask. She kept her schedule. She made her coffee. On the 4th of March, she was in the garden with Theo at 8 in the morning, when she heard the first car arrive, then a second, then a third. Mr. O appeared at the garden door. "Could you bring Theo inside, please? Immediately." She picked up Theo without asking questions, and she had them inside and in the sitting room, with the door closed within 90 seconds. She could hear voices in the main hall, more people than usual, a compressed energy in the sound of the place that she had not felt since Byung-soo's January visit. She sat in the sitting room with Theo and waited. She waited 2 hours. She heard at some point a raised voice. Not Joon-ho. She'd never heard Joon-ho raise his voice, not fully. Someone else. Then the specific quality of silence that followed a room adjusting to something that had just been said. Then nothing. Then, at 10:17, the cars leaving. At 10:40, Mr. O knocked on her door. "Mr. Kang would like to see you." She put Theo with the bear and went. The east wing was quieter than usual, the specific silence of aftermath. She walked down the corridor and pushed open the door. Joon-ho was at the window, the same position as their first morning. He turned when she came in. He looked, she thought, different, but not tired. Something had resolved in his face that had been unresolved for a long time. Something had been settled. "Sit down," he said. This time she sat. "Byung-soo won't be coming to the estate again," he said. She waited. "There's nothing you need to know about the details." He said it without apology. "But I wanted you to know that." "Okay," she said. "I also wanted to—" He stopped. He set his hands flat on the arms of the chair, which was a gesture she'd come to recognize as him preparing to say something he didn't have a prepared form for. "I've been thinking about what you said in January, about what he was planning. I didn't say much. You said enough." A pause. You said, "Let him plan." And then you walked out. And I sat there for a month thinking about that. She said nothing. "It made me deal with it instead of waiting for it," he said, "which is what I would have done otherwise. Waited." She looked at him. "You don't need to tell me that," she said. "No." He met her eyes. "I know I don't." The silence was a different shape than usual. She'd learned the vocabulary of his silences by now. The controlled ones, the hostile ones, the ones that were just him processing. This one was new. This one had something in it that she recognized because she'd been carrying the same thing for several weeks and had been very carefully not putting it down. "Joon-ho," she said. He didn't react to the name. She'd never used it before, without the title, without the professional distance of Mr. Kang. He held very still. "I need you to know something," she said. "Not I'm going to say it once, and then we're going to decide what to do with it." He waited. "I'm not a complicated person," she said. "I don't have a complicated angle on this. I have a job and I have my son, and I have a specific situation that I am navigating with the resources available to me. And the resources available to me include—" She stopped. Reset. "Being here has been not what I expected. You are not what I expected. And I'm not telling you that because I want something from it. I'm telling you because I think you should know that someone in this house sees you. Not the chair. Not the empire. Not the version of yourself you're managing for everyone else. You." He was very still. "I'm not asking you to respond to that," she said. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I just needed you to have that information." She stood up. "Imani," he said. She stopped. "The day the kid climbed into my lap," he said, and his voice was careful, like someone navigating terrain they haven't mapped. "I hadn't." He stopped. There's a version of me that I thought was gone. After my daughter. After the hospital. I thought it was just gone. And then this 2-year-old shows up with a cracker, and I'm—" He broke off. She stayed very still. "I don't know what this is," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I do. But I don't want you to leave when the contract ends." She looked at him for a long time. "I'm not planning to leave," she said. She walked back to her wing. She sat on the floor next to Theo. She let him climb into her lap with the bear, and she held him, and she let the stone in her chest, the one she'd been carrying for weeks, or settle finally into something that was not a burden and not a weight, something that felt, cautiously, like beginning. March became April, and the lavender in the garden came up. She was there with Theo on the morning the first shoots appeared, small, purple-grey, barely visible against the dark soil. And she turned to find Joon-ho had come out to the adapted path without her noticing. He was looking at the garden. Theo looked up at him. "Flowers," he announced. "Flowers," Joon-ho said. "Chairman's flowers." The corner of Joon-ho's mouth did something she had been waiting 2 months to see. Not quite a smile, something on the way to one. Something that was the structural precursor to a smile in a face that hadn't practiced for a long time. She filed it away in the place where she kept the things she was not going to ruin by looking at them too directly. "Mr. Shin is pleased," she said. "Mr. Shin has been trying to get lavender in that bed for 3 years, Joon-ho said. I kept telling him no." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. A pause. "Because it was Sua's favorite," he said. And then, before she could say anything, "My daughter. Her name was Sua." She let that sit. "It's a good name," she said. "Yes." Quietly. "It is." Theo, unaware of the weight in the air, had crouched down to examine a shoot with intense botanical interest. She watched him. She felt Joon-ho watching him. "She would have been 7 this spring," he said. "She would have terrorized this garden," Imani said. Something moved in his face. "She would have." A pause. "She used to try to dig things up, to see the roots." Theo tried to eat a worm in October. The almost smile came back, stayed a little longer this time. "I'm sorry," she said. Simple. Not performed. Just the truth of what she felt about it. He looked at her. "I know," he said. They stood in the garden in the early spring morning, with the lavender coming up, and a 2-year-old narrating his investigation of the soil, and the weight of what had been said and what had not been said, sat between them like something that had found its right place. Later, she would think about this morning as the moment the slow thaw of everything that had been frozen in the east wing became something she could feel beneath her hands. Not heat, exactly. Warmth. The specific warmth of something returning to itself. This is the part of the story, if you have been watching this long, that you already know you cannot stop now. And if you haven't subscribed, do it before the next paragraph. Like this video. Leave a comment. Tell us what you feel right now, in this garden, with these 2 people, and this child, and the lavender that belongs to a little girl who is not here. This is the moment. You are in it. Come back for the rest of it. April gave way to May, and May was warm, and the estate opened up the way places do when the cold has been held in them too long. Windows propped open in the mornings, the garden full again. Chef Bai's food noticeably cheerful, which she'd come to read as accurately as weather. The morning coffees had expanded into something more, not structured, not scheduled, just a natural extension of time that neither of them had pulled back from. They talked, and not always about anything consequential. Joon-ho had opinions about what she was reading, which surprised her the first time and stopped surprising her by the third. He asked her about nursing, about the trauma ward, about the cases that had stayed with her. He listened the way people listened when they genuinely wanted to understand, not just waiting for their turn to speak. She noticed this about him, the quality of his attention. It was one of the few things about him that had no tactical element to it. He listened to her the way she imagined he might have listened to Suar, or the way he might have listened before the loss had taught him that listening to things led to losing them. There was an effort in it. She could see that, the small, deliberate opening of himself toward what she was saying, like a door that had been sealed for a long time and was being reopened carefully, with awareness of each hinge. She asked about Seoul, not the business of it, but the city, the parts he'd known before the shooting had changed his geography. He told her about a restaurant in Mapo that had been there since before he was born, which no longer existed, but which he still thought about. He told her about a bridge he used to walk when he was trying to think, before walking had required recalculation. He told her the names of the streets of his particular neighborhood of Seoul, the way you tell someone the places that made you, with the specificity of love and the precision of grief. She told him about Atlanta, the particular way the city existed in her body, even from thousands of miles away. The smell, the specific quality of summer heat, the way her family's kitchen sounded on Sunday mornings. She told him about the 2 years on the trauma floor and the patients she'd learned the most from, and the ones she still thought about. A man named Mr. Adeyemi, who had survived something terrible and had spent 3 weeks refusing to speak to anyone, and then one morning had looked at her and said, very quietly, "I think I'm going to be okay." And she'd said, "I know. I've known for 2 weeks." And he'd laughed, the first laugh which she'd been waiting for, which meant the turning. Joon-ho had listened to this and said nothing for a moment. "You knew before he did," he said. "You always know before they do," she said. "That's the job, knowing what's possible before they believe it themselves." He was quiet again. She told him what it felt like to be here. Not in this house, but in Seoul, in Korea, in the particular geography of being black and American and female and excellent in a room that had not expected you. He listened to this the most carefully of all. "You stay," he said, after she'd described a particular moment at a clinic she'd applied to, the specific expression of the interviewer when she'd walked in. "I stay." Why? She thought about it. Because leaving would mean they won, and I don't grant that. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "You don't." It was not a compliment. It was something more accurate than that. A recognition, the specific acknowledgement of seeing something real in someone. She held it. She let herself hold it. Seonjae found her in the kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon and sat down with the careful face he used when he had something to say that he'd been deciding whether to say. She poured him coffee. She waited. "He's going back," Seonjae said. She looked at him. "To the organization, formally. There's a meeting next week, the full council. He's going to be present in person for the first time since the hospital." She processed this. "Is that... It's what he should have done 4 months ago," Seonjae said. "But he wasn't..." He paused. "He wasn't ready. And now he is." Seonjae looked at her with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite credit, but was in the neighborhood of both. "I think so." She drank her coffee. "He asked me to tell you," Seonjae said. "Not to." He stopped, or he wanted you to know before it happened. She understood. He was telling her because the thing between them had become real enough that it was his information to give. That she was the person who got to know first. "Thank you," she said. Seonjae nodded. He finished his coffee and left. She sat in the kitchen for a while after and let the weight of that settle. The particular weight of being chosen to know. The day of the council meeting, she woke at 4. She didn't go back to sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the estate, the specific silence of a place preparing for something. And she ran through the things she knew and the things she didn't. She knew he was capable. She had watched enough of how he operated, even from behind the professional distance she maintained, or to have no doubt that the capacity that had built what he'd built was entirely intact. The injury had not touched his mind, his judgment, his authority. Those were not in his legs. She had been watching him run this organization from a room at the end of a corridor for 5 months, and the organization had not crumbled. It had been strained and tested, and it had held because the person holding it was the same person who had always held it. What the injury had done was to his image, his mythology, the specific story that the people in that room would need to believe, that the man at the head of the table was invincible, unreachable, beyond the ordinary vulnerabilities of men. The chair interrupted that story. It offered a different narrative to anyone who wanted to use it. Byung-soo had been using it for 5 months. She knew he was capable. She also knew the people in that room would not all be glad he was back. Some of them had rearranged their understanding of the future to include a permanent vacancy at the head of the table, and the permanent vacancy had been walking around in Byung-soo's expensive suit. She knew that whatever happened in that room would determine a significant portion of what came after, for him and for the estate and for the people in it. She did not know what came after for her. That was the part she hadn't solved. She got up at 5 and made the coffee. He was there at 5:50. He was dressed differently, not the estate's casual, but the formal version of himself that she'd seen in photographs and had understood as something distinct. Dark suit, the particular bearing he adjusted for business. But he looked entirely like the man Seoul feared, and not at all like the man who kept a collection of a 2-year-old's treasures on the corner of his desk. She looked at him. "Coffee?" she said. "Already had some." Then, after a pause, "Thank you for making it anyway." She leaned against the counter. "You don't need to do this today," she said. "If you're not ready." "I'm ready." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I'm saying you have a choice. That's different from needing to." He looked at her for a long moment. "I have a son," she said. "He's 2 years old and he calls you chairman, and last week you held him for 40 minutes while he fell asleep in your lap. That's who you are. Whatever that room thinks, whatever that room is going to say about what you can or can't do, it doesn't change who you are." He held the look. "Nurse, don't say anything like that before I walk into a room like that," he said. But his voice, underneath the flat surface of it, was not flat. "I'll save it for after," she said. He left at 7. She spent the day very busy with things that required her full attention. She cleaned the sitting room thoroughly, properly, with the kind of attention she gave things when she was trying to keep her hands occupied, so the rest of her would stay calm. She took Theo to the garden for an extended visit, and while Theo conducted his investigations, she stood in the lavender and breathed and thought about nothing, which was a skill she'd developed in the trauma ward and which served her well now. She made dinner for Theo and ate with him on the floor of the sitting room because it was his preference. Now she read him 3 books instead of the usual one. She held him longer than usual before she put him down, and he submitted to this with the equanimity of a child who had always been held, and therefore did not find it alarming. She sat in the sitting room with her book open in her lap and did not read it. She thought about the man who had gotten into that car this morning, dressed in the version of himself that Soul feared, and about the man who had set out 3 cups last week because it had become true that there were 3 people in this house who took coffee in the morning. She thought about how both of those people were the same person, and what it cost to be both of them at once. She thought about what she would do if it went wrong, if the room was what Byung-soo had been preparing it to be, if the power that had been shifting while Joon-ho sat in the East Wing had shifted too far to be reclaimed in a single meeting. She sat with that, and found that she wasn't as afraid of it as she expected, which was its own kind of information. She did not go to the East Wing. She put Theo to bed with the bear and the slightly crooked cap. She sat in the sitting room with her book open in her lap and did not read it. At 9:45, there was a knock at her door. She opened it. Joon-ho was in the corridor. He looked. She did an assessment in 3 seconds, the clinical reflex. Not injured, not depleted. The opposite. He looked like someone who had come from somewhere significant and was still carrying the altitude of it. "How did it go?" she asked. He looked at her. "You were right," he said. "What about what's in the room and what isn't?" She waited. "They can see what's in the chair. They can't see what isn't." A pause. It worked in my favor. She breathed out. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." He came into the sitting room for the first time. She made tea, and he sat near the window, and they talked for an hour. Not about the meeting, which he gave the outline of, and she didn't push for more, but about other things, the things they'd been building toward for months. She told him about the medical textbook, what she'd been reading, a section on spinal rehabilitation that was more current than the approach his medical team had been using. He had a precise mind, and he asked precise questions, and she answered them honestly, as a nurse, with the information she had. And then she asked him something she'd been carrying since January. "The rehabilitation," she said. "You've been doing it alone." He didn't answer. "You don't have to," she said. "I know you know that, but I'm saying it in case it helps to hear it from outside your own head." He was quiet for a moment. "The file said you didn't ring for morning assistance," she said. "Since the shooting." "I didn't need—" "You might have." She said it gently. "Or you might not have. But refusing help isn't the same as not needing it. You know that." He looked at her. "You're going to tell me this is about Sua?" "No," she said. "I think it's about you. I think you decided that needing anything was the most dangerous thing you could do. And then the thing you couldn't control happened anyway. And instead of revising the theory, you doubled down on it." The silence. "It's a common response," she said, "in people who've experienced significant loss, followed by significant injury. The body's way of protecting against more." "Clinical," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. "But also just—" She paused. "You're the most capable person I've seen in years, and you've been trying to do everything alone in a room by yourself, and I've been watching you do it for 5 months, and I'm telling you that you don't have to." He was looking at her with that expression, the fully open one, no armor anywhere, the one she'd first seen when Theo had climbed into his lap and the room had held its breath. "Imane," he said. "Yes. I need you to know." He stopped. Started again. "What you said this morning, before the meeting, about who I am." She waited. "No one has said anything like that to me in 4 years," he said. Maybe longer. She held the look. I know, she said quietly. I don't know what to do with it. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. That's the point. You can just have it. He sat with that for a moment. Then, with the slow deliberateness of someone extending something they would not extend if they had not decided to, he reached across the space between their chairs and put his hand over hers. Not taking, not claiming. Just there. The weight and warmth of a hand placed with intention. She turned her hand over and held it. They sat in the sitting room while the estate settled around them, and the night ran its course, and she felt, with a completeness she hadn't felt in years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not despite everything, not despite the distance from Atlanta, or the debt that had shadowed her, or the choices that had led her here, through choices that had led her here through closed doors. Because of it. All of it. The path was not a straight line. It never was. But she was standing at the end of a path that had required every specific version of her hardship, and her strength, and her particular way of walking into difficult rooms without flinching, and the end of that path was this sitting room, this hand, this man who had needed someone to see him and had found, in the most improbable way available, someone who could. She thought about Theo. She would have to tell him at some point. Not now, not yet, but eventually, that the world was not always kind to people who loved across the lines it drew. That this was real, but that love was worth navigating the real. But she also thought about a 2-year-old who had crossed a forbidden threshold with a cracker and an absolute absence of the fear that the threshold was meant to create. She thought about what it meant to raise someone like that. Someone who walked toward instead of away. Someone who offered instead of withheld. She thought she was doing okay. Outside the window, the estate was dark and quiet, and the lavender was sleeping in its beds, and there was a child down the hall who had started all of this by being himself so completely that there had been no room for anyone around him to be anything less. The lavender was in full bloom in June. She had been on the estate 8 months, and the agency had called with the bonus, the 6-month bonus that no one had ever earned before her, and she had deposited it, and paid the debt, and closed the account it had been eating from, and the particular lightness of no longer carrying it had made a difference. She was still registering 2 weeks later. Theo knew the garden by heart now. He knew Mr. Shin by name, and had developed what could only be called a working relationship with him. They communicated in a hybrid language of pointed fingers and nods, and the occasional shared cracker that seemed fully functional to both parties. She had seen Theo fall asleep in Joon-ho's lap 4 times since the sitting room night. It had stopped being an event. It had become a weather pattern. She had also, and this was the part she thought about most carefully, not because she was careful by nature and careful by circumstance, and careful by every lesson that had followed her from Atlanta to Seoul, been thinking about what it meant that she was still here. Not the job. The job was clear. She had found something in this house she could sustain, and she was sustaining it. But she had also found, slowly, through coffee and lavender, and one hand placed over another in a sitting room at midnight, something she was not prepared to call by its name yet, because naming it changed what it was, and she wanted to be sure before she changed it. She was sure. She had been sure for a while. It was Seon Jae who told her about Joon-ho's interview with the rehabilitation specialist. Not directly, he mentioned it in passing, of the way he sometimes mentioned things that he wanted her to know and had chosen this method of conveying. I hear the boss has started with a new specialist. Very current methods. Someone recommended someone to recommend someone. She kept her face neutral. Good, she said. Yes. Seonjae did not quite smile. Very good. She did not mention it to Joon-ho directly, but that evening, when she was leaving her coffee setting for the morning, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway, she looked at him and said simply, "How are you feeling?" He understood what she was asking. "Like something might be possible," he said. "That's good," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "It is." She went to bed. In the morning, there were 3 cups set out. She looked at them. Theo, who had followed her to the kitchen, looked at them too. "Mine," he said, pointing to the smallest. "That's yours," she agreed. "Chairman's," he said, pointing to the second. "That's his." Theo pointed to the third. "Mama's," he said, with the satisfied finality of naming something that was already true. She stood in the kitchen and felt the stone that had lived in her chest for a long time, different from the debt, from the fear, from the weight of choices that ran out, transform into something else entirely. She made the coffee. On an evening in July, she and Joon-ho were in the garden after Theo was in bed. This had become a thing. The garden in the evenings when it was warm, the adapted path wide enough for the chair, the lavender giving off its particular smell in the cooling air. The estate's perimeter lights came on at 8, and between 7:30 and 8, the garden was lit the way old photographs were lit. Everything warm and slightly imprecise, the edges of things softened. She had started to think of this hour as theirs. She had not said this aloud. She was careful, still, about certain things, about the distance between being present and making claims, about the difference between what she felt and what was appropriate to say. And when. She had spent her professional life calibrating this, knowing what a patient needed, and knowing when to offer it, and knowing that offering too soon was as harmful as not offering at all. She brought this same precision to herself. She waited until she was sure. She did not make a sound before she knew it was the right sound. She was sure now. Had been sure for a while. She was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment kept presenting itself, and she kept choosing the moment slightly after it, because she was careful, and because this was the most important thing she had done in years, and she did not want to get it wrong. They were talking about something. She couldn't have said afterward exactly what. Some conversation about the city, about a place she wanted to take Theo, about the way Seoul looked at night from the hill above the estate. And she became aware that he had stopped talking and was looking at her. She looked back. "What?" she said. "Nothing." And then, before she could respond, "I want to tell you something. I'm going to say it once, and then." He paused, and she recognized the rhythm of this, because she had used it herself, in this same house, 6 months ago. She waited. "I haven't wanted to live inside my own life," he said, "in 4 years. Not the way I used to. Not with the specific hunger of it. I existed. I managed things. But the wanting was..." He stopped. "And then your son showed up with a cracker, and I realized that the part of me I thought was gone was just waiting for something I didn't know I was allowed to have again." She said nothing. "I'm not saying this to make a claim on you," he said. "I know what this situation looks like from the outside. I know what you've risked by being here, in this house, in this position. Joon-ho." He stopped. "Stop explaining it," she said. "I already know all of that. I've known it for months." She looked at him in the evening garden, in the lavender, in the particular light that was making everything gold and soft. "But I'm not afraid of the outside. You should be," I know. She held his look. I'm not. The silence between them was the best kind, the kind that held everything they'd been saying for months, without saying it. The kind that was the last breath before something changed. He reached out his hand. She took it. The garden was warm and the lavender was in bloom, and somewhere in the house behind them, a 2-year-old was asleep with a bear, and she held the hand of the man she had come to this house, not expecting to find, and she felt with the steady completeness of something true. This was not where she'd thought she was going. It was where she was supposed to be. 3 months later, she called her mother. It was a Sunday morning. Theo was in the garden with Mr. Shin. No, she was in the sitting room with coffee and the particular quality of October light coming through the window, different from last October's light, which had come through a different window in a different room, and had found her in the first week of this job, calculating survival. This October's light found her differently. It found someone who had stopped calculating quite so constantly. Her mother picked up on the second ring. "You sound different," her mother said, before she'd said anything except hello. "I'm good," she said. "Mama, I'm really good." A silence on the Atlanta end of the line. Then, with the careful precision of a woman who had been waiting for this, and was not going to make it fragile by holding it too tight. "Tell me," she told her. Not all of it. Not the empire. Not the complications. Not the specific architecture of the world she'd navigated to get here. But the part that mattered. Theo, who called a man in a wheelchair chairman and had given him back a reason to stay inside his own life. The lavender, the textbook, the hand in the garden, the person she had found herself to be in this house, in this city, in this life she had chosen when all her other choices had run out. She told her about the morning she'd stood outside the East Wing door at midnight and knocked because she'd decided that being afraid of being wrong was not better than knowing. She told her about the 3 cups on the counter. Or she told her about a little girl named Sua and about a man who had stopped being reachable after losing her and had not known he was waiting for something until a cracker arrived in his lap via a 2-year-old who had no concept of impossibility. She told her about the moment in the garden, the hand, the lavender, the evening, and her mother was quiet on the other end for a long time. "Is he good to Theo?" her mother asked. "He is," she said. "Really good." "Is he good to you?" She thought about the coffee he made when she hadn't slept, the blanket on Theo's bed, the textbook, the tile fixed on Thursday, the lavender planted in 3 nurseries because she'd mentioned it once in passing, and he had understood that it was important even when she hadn't explained why. "Yes," she said. "He is." Another silence. "What, you sound like yourself," her mother said. "The real you. The one I've been waiting to hear from for a while." "I know," she said. "She's been here. She was just finding her footing." "She always finds it," her mother said. "That's what she does. I learned it from somewhere." Her mother made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite something else, but was the sound of love in its most specific, unperformed register. "Come home sometime. Bring Theo. Bring—" a pause. "If he's important, bring him. I'll make food." She smiled. "I'll tell him. Tell him my food is good. I'll tell him it's the best." "It is the best," her mother said, with the dignity of a statement of fact. After she hung up, she sat in the sitting room for a while. She could hear Theo in the garden. His commentary had reached some new crescendo, or something to do with a beetle from the sound of it. She could hear, from the direction of the East Wing, the voice of someone Seon-jae had brought for a meeting, and beneath it, not performing and not managing, and simply being what he was, Joon-ho's voice responding. She picked up her coffee. She thought about the gate she hadn't latched properly on a Tuesday in October, about the cracker extended to a man in a wheelchair by a boy who had never learned to be afraid of things without first investigating them, about the specific mechanism of a thing, small, unplanned, improbable, that turned out to be the door. All of it because Theo, who was now explaining something at high volume about the beetle to Mr. Shin, had no map for the territory that other people had marked as forbidden. She thought about that sometimes, about all the rooms that don't get entered, all the people who don't get reached, all the lavender that doesn't get planted, because someone somewhere put up a sign that said, "Don't go in there." And everyone listened. Everyone except a 2-year-old with a cracker and a bear and a red cap slightly askew. She smiled into her coffee. She went to the garden. Chairman was already there. Joon-ho had come out before she reached the door. She could see him on the adapted path, in the morning light, with Theo standing beside his chair, holding up the beetle on a leaf, with the gravity of a scientist presenting findings. Joon-ho was looking at it with full seriousness. Mr. Shin had stepped back, with the comfortable remove of someone who understood that this particular conversation didn't require him. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked at them, the man in the chair and the small boy beside him, and she felt the specific weight of a thing you recognize as important while you are inside it, which was different from recognizing it after. She was inside it. She knew it was important. She did not look away. Theo's voice carried across the garden with the absolute conviction of the very small. Something about the beetle. Something about the garden. Something that was not entirely words, but was entirely communication. Joon-ho was responding in the measured, direct way he responded to everything Theo said. Not simplified, not performed, just genuine engagement with whatever was being offered. She had watched Joon-ho with Theo more times than she could count by now, and it had not stopped doing what it did to her. The careful hand, the full attention, the way he held the things Theo brought him, literally and otherwise. She had her clinical language for all of it. She had stopped using it months ago. She also thought about something Seonjai had said to her, quietly, after the March meeting. He's different. She had agreed. What she hadn't said was, so am I, that this house, which she had come to for survival, had given her back something she hadn't known she'd lost. A version of herself that was not just capable but present. Not just surviving but inhabiting the life she was in, with all its complications and its specificities, fully. She had been half present for longer than she'd realized. The move had done that, and then the loss of the partnership had done it more. She had been performing her strength rather than feeling it. Or she had been managing rather than living. She had been making the coffee and counting the days and doing the job and holding the line. And then her son had climbed into a wheelchair, and something that had been sealed off in her had opened at the same time something in Joon-ho had opened, and the opening had been mutual and gradual and had taken months to name, and now it was named, and it was real, and she was standing in a doorway in October light, looking at the two people she loved most in the world. Theo looked up and saw her. "Mama," he said. "Beetle." "I see the beetle." Theo held it out toward Joon-ho for final review. Joon-ho accepted the leaf. He examined the beetle with the same thoroughness he gave everything. The estate around them was bright and quiet. The lavender had gone to seed now. It would come back in spring, or fuller than before, the way things came back when they were finally allowed to grow. There was already a plan. She'd mentioned it to Mr. Shin, who had already been planning it, for expanding the beds next year. More lavender, more of whatever else Suar might have liked, a garden that remembered and also grew. Joon-ho looked up at Theo with the expression she kept in the most permanent part of her memory, the one she was going to carry forward, past this estate, past this season, past everything that changed and everything that stayed, undefended, fully present, completely without armor. "It's a good one," he said. Theo beamed. He turned around to share the beam with her, the way he shared everything, and she received it, or the full force of him, this small person who had walked through every closed door she'd encountered in the past year without asking permission. She walked into the garden. The lavender was there. The morning was there. Her son was there. And the man who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting was there. And she was there. All of her. The nurse and the mother and the woman who had gotten on a plane 3 years ago looking for a beginning, and had found it in the last place she'd expected, in the most difficult room in a difficult house, on a Tuesday morning when she'd let Theo find his way to a cracker and a lap, and a man who needed to be reminded that some things were still possible. She stood in the lavender and breathed. Joon-ho looked up from the beetle. He looked at her across the garden, in the light, with the specific directness of a man who had stopped managing the distance between himself and the things he wanted. She held the look. She had found her footing. She was standing on it, and the garden, which had been waiting to be a garden for a long time, was exactly that. If this story reached into your chest and held something there, if you stayed up past the hour you meant to because you couldn't leave these people and this garden and this child who was never afraid, then you already know what to do. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment that tells us what you felt in the moment Joon-ho took that cracker, or held that hand, or set out 3 cups in the morning because a family had found its way into a house that had been waiting to be one. We make these stories for you. Come back for the next one. We'll be here.